Namaste and welcome to Indica Changemakers to Kalyan ji. Thank you so much for
Namaste,
joining us
Pranaji.
today.
Thank you.
And I think you're most with a engineering as well as a management background. You're also interested in Indian themes related to modernity, tradition, and continuity, as you put it, and dharma, religion, ecology, economics, technology, and society. So we would like to ask you about these topics of interest. Yeah. So,
Sure. Yeah.
when did the shift happen, or rather, when was the first spark of interest started in you when you started exploring these topics?
Sure. Yeah. So I think like it's been a journey largely like maybe it started at one point in time and it like slowly matured over time. I'd probably put this maybe somewhere when I was in like when my undergrad education was just starting, perhaps when I was in like 18, 19. That's when probably I got more inclined into trying to understand the our past in terms of, let's say, even if you take something like technology, right? So how was India before British in terms of technology? What were our achievements? What was our perspective on science, so on. And then I think there was a general interest in history, which is mostly in terms of knowing about our past. So I remember I spoke about this in one of my recent conversations with someone as well. This is something like I distinctly remember when I joined my engineering, like in my first year when we were having these conversations, right? Like what do you want to do in life, kind of thing. I very distinctly remember I was talking about this like wonder that was India, that kind of books, and then I want to reconnect our past to contemporary sort of traditions, contemporary life living. So it pretty much it was there from that era. Right from when I was studying my undergrad, and then slowly I think through that process, like where I studied my undergrad at IIIT Hyderabad, there were a lot of like Indic-minded professors and the people who are associated with the Rampalji, so on. So that was an influence. And then I had like one of my seniors who also is one of my best friends on these matters for a long time now. So we used to discuss a lot of these topics as well. So I think that also played a role. And then I think I'd say it got more and more serious after I got into the corporate, spent some time, and then I did my MBA at IIM Lucknow. And when I was there, I sort of got this overall picture on business world, economics, globalization, marketing, advertising, a whole bunch of things, right? So I think as I went through all of that, again, I got into a lot of questions on sustainability, on economics, on inequality, and all of that. And I think around pretty much that time, I was also trying to like understand the teachings of our dharmacharyas like Kanchi Paramacharya, Puri Shankaracharya, Karpatri Swami, Sringeri Acharyas, some of the Madhvacharyas, and in general, a lot of these people who were trying to uh, understand the role of tradition in this in the post like 20th century sort of setup. So I think that's how it has been. And then over time, every time I get into serious thinking on something, I try to go here and there, and then I come back to something which has like strong links to Sanatana Dharma. So that's how it's been. So that's how it like probably give a brief of my journey into all this.
Wonderful. Actually, today morning I spoke to Raghava Krishnaji of Brihad, and he was
Mhm.
telling, in our generation, I think maybe I'm older than you by a bit. So, in our generation, it was very clear that up to 25, 35, we had in our mind that we had to get a job and we had to earn this
Right.
money and we had to, start a family. It was very unidirectional, our path. But today, when our kids are growing up, we are telling them, you have to look after the civilizational aspects, and this is what you have to protect. This is the path you have to walk. So, do you think there's a confusion that we are creating by, we had a very clear outlook, which is what they are pursuing today, but we are telling them that they have to be more inclined towards Sanatana Dharma. Is there a dichotomy in this?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say a dichotomy of this kind, perhaps a dichotomy of a different kind, in the sense that so there is this whole thesis, right, which is broadly how the like the secular or liberal sort of a mind generally operates, which is that as you become more and more prosperous, religion kind of recedes. That's been the broad thinking globally, that people will become less religious as they become richer. But then in our generation and in the India story, pretty much if you see what happened post liberalization, as more and more prosperity came in, people started looking more and more for their roots, and if they want to spend their money also, right? It's like building temples, going to pilgrimages. Even if I mean, even if you use the word temple tourism, that's still the fact that as more and more of us are getting money, we are actually ending up doing more and more religion, not less and less of it. I mean, we may be doing 10 other things as well, but distinctly we are still like embracing more and more of religion. So I think uh, while with the initially maybe there was a bit of this whole per capita income, that sort of a struggle, but once people got into jobs, once they start earning some money, there is still that some sort of an emptiness that sort of creeps in, right? And then the search for meaning broadly, people are also like, just money doesn't seem to fill that vacuum. So you'll like maybe buy, like all of us, right? When we started with a small 21-inch TV or a 14-inch TV, and then after a point it's like the TV can only grow so big. You also realize that it's not about
Yeah.
accumulating more and more of these material goods. So I think that part is definitely there, where after a point all of us do realize that in terms of that like emptiness or search for meaning kind of thing. And then the other thing I noticed broadly is also this thing that especially this generation, what I would say is like the post 80s 90s, the generation that really saw the fruits of this whole liberalized economy kind of thing, right? Where you are essentially richer than your parents, lot of us. I mean, the kind of people who follow this conversation on Indica, right? It's mostly the people who are the English speaking, English understanding, that sort of a population. This is all the people that saw prosperity post 90s. And then that's the generation that also became parents. And then they started realizing that what do I pass on to my next generation? Because your parents also were busy in that whole struggle for existence kind of a mode. And now I think as one more generation became parents, and then this whole like, what do I transfer, or what do I stand for as a culture? It can't be that be a software engineer or be a businessman cannot be what I pass on to my next generation. There has to be something more, like what is the whole Indian identity about, and all of that. So I think that is happening. But the broader dichotomy I see is this, that like some of my friends ask me that when you do all of this IKS, Dharma, all of that and all, but then ultimately you are working in the global economy, you are working with a multinational company. So how does it matter? So I think that dichotomy is a bigger of a struggle, in the sense that to be popular and to be rich in today's world, you don't need to be a Hindu. Like if you look at the richest person in the world, right, and that person may not be a Hindu, or the companies that you adulate for innovation or for doing great things, they may not be Hindus. So, and they may be running the economy, right? The richest country in the world is not a Hindu country. So I think these are the bigger dichotomies, where we are trying to say that like Sanatan Dharma or Hinduism is fundamental to like sustainability, and that's my core from where I get meaning and everything, right? And then so much of the world is running without it. So and then we are also participating in that same economy, where largely we live a secular existence. Like when I go to work, I don't carry my Hinduism there because there's no audience for that there. So that is a bigger dichotomy I feel, where like for the next generation as well, when we are telling this, and then they are also entering into this whole broadly secularized economy, and that's a bit of a struggle, where they see that that world is not at all listening to Hinduism in any matter. And yeah, so I think that's a bit of a struggle. Yes.
Right, yeah. I think we had the meta retreat on nationalism and trying to reconcile some of these conflicts.
Mhm.
So I have put out some questions for you, if I may go, over them with you,
Sure.
with regards to the topic of nationalism.
Mhm.
So, in terms of this impact of social changes that you're talking about, we have certain institutions and which have been very central to our society and have been destroyed. You mentioned the village, caste, and the joint family. And what has the destruction of these three institutions? How has it affected society? Apart from this workspace versus personal journey,
Mhm.
these three, the village, caste, and the joint family, with this being erased, what how has it affected the common Indian?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think even here, right? Like this pretty much like a broader trend that played out in all countries in the world, wherever the post-industrial societies, right? Pre-industrial societies, largely they were all like this, like mostly set in a village and have a community and all of that. But I think in our case, we didn't plan for this change by ourselves. It came to us through the colonial modernity. So it is like I think we couldn't really sit as a people and then understand, okay, to do this I'll lose this, and then if this goes, so it just hit us. And I think many say that we have still not recovered from it thoroughly. We are still in the process of recovery in that sense. So for us particularly, I feel that because of the way Hinduism largely operates, right? I mean, it's all polycentric. Like there's so much diversity. There's no one church. There is no like one book, or there is no like one mullah, that sort of a model, right? We don't operate that way, where we have one single source which kind of controls, or even like a papal kind of a structure, right, where you have a village parish and then a church, and then the church rolls up to a particular authority. So we don't have that sort of a model, and our entire model was largely built around this family traditions and whatever is handed off, right? So from you pretty much, the festivals you follow or rituals you do, it's all, you just blindly follow whatever has been given to you from top. It is not that from your previous generation, basically what your father told, what your grandmother told, that sort of a thing. So I think for that the impact is a lot higher, because once these connections are broken, once families are have shrunk, and then the family professions are also have gone, and where every individual is pretty much on their own, and there's a lot of mobility where you have to move away from a space. So that I think hit us much more differently, because of this lack of like a centralized structure, or a lack of more universal sort of a model. Because like even today, right, let's say if you want to connect with some of these things, sometimes it may so happen that you may stay in a community of, let's say, 100 families, but the ritual you do at home, others may not be doing, although they are Hindu, because that's how we are. I mean, the variations are just so many. So it sometimes it also happens because of that whole break, that you are perhaps in a more homogeneous community in that sense, where all of the people in your village, maybe they could understand some Kuladevata worship you're doing, or some Jatra you're doing, or like a Grama Devata sort of thing. Now you take that off and then come to a city where everybody is a stranger of sorts, then a lot of those community gatherings also lose their meaning. So again, it's pretty much everybody on their own. And that's where I think the rupture is a bit higher for us, because of this whole model where we anchored a lot more on families, communities, like Kula communities, Jati communities, Grama, or the village communities. So everything was based on that. Even like your day-to-day conduct, right? I mean, people talk about it keeps coming up in this uniform civil code sort of a discussions as well, where like there is no one Hindu code that you can say that this is how all Hindus operate on. There's just so much customs and traditions that we have. And today, when you ask, is this appropriate for a Hindu to do? In some of these things, it's also very difficult to give an answer, because there may not even be like a one standard Hindu way of doing that particular thing. Like we see, I mean, if you look at the debates, let's say, that happened in things like the Hindu Code Bill and all that, where that's a part of this journey, right? Because you never needed that Hindu Code Bill when this previous system was there, because it's like a decentralized self-policing sort of a model that was happening. But now, once you urbanized, and once this whole nationalism or a nation state sort of came into picture, they needed a common way in which all Hindus can be policed, or all Hindu affairs can be dealt with. And if you look into those debates, it's again the same things that keep coming up. Like one person says, "This is my acharam. This is how we are. How can you say that this is wrong as per whatever you are defining? This is how our customs are. Who are you to say that my custom is wrong," and all that? So I think this is all very like a unique set of problems that we have gotten into, because of this whole maybe like what I'd say is like an unplanned rupture. If we had planned for it, maybe we would have done it. Like if you're going through a surgery, right? If you know that you are going through it, you'll plan for that surgery and aftermath of the surgery. But in our case, it's like some sort of a forced accident, or like an amputation, and we didn't figure out what to do with it post that. So I think that's a bigger challenge, and it's more acute for, I think, a non-Abrahamic cultures compared to an Abrahamic sort of a model.
Even visibly, our landscape has changed. And in one of your interviews, the speaker says, the highest things that he saw were, hills and gopurams and trees,
Correct.
and now it's
Correct.
like totally gone. So when what happens to our civilization when we move from, a reverence for nature to conquering nature? Since your interest is also about ecology and environment, visible, absence of nature and natural scapes, how does that impact us?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And just going back to the previous point that you made, right? I think they're both connected in a way that the highest visible entity or structure in that city being a temple versus today we see like skyscrapers and concrete largely, right? And that's pretty much how a broad city life operates. I think it was Professor Vamsi Juluri who made that point in one of those conversations. And I think that is something that is very acutely felt for people who are like me, like who have been brought in a pretty much in an urban sort of a setup, right? Where the only greenery you see is when you have to escape this place and go out. Pretty much, if you
Yeah.
step out, you practically see a concrete jungle kind of thing. So I think that's where like the whole the way in which we look at nature, right? Like for a long time, our civilization, like even if you look at Vedas and all that, it's all rivers. So rivers define the civilization, right? The health of the rivers is pretty much like an index of the health of the civilization. And the city where I live in, Hyderabad, has a river called Musi, or the traditional name is Muchkunda river, and it's in a very shabby state, and it's been like that for all my life. So that's kind of an index of how our civilization is on these matters, right? And like, of course, I mean, we know about the foam in the Yamuna River in Delhi. So these are all, I think, indicators of how things are in today's times. And that point that you made about like looking at nature as a like inert and then conquest of nature sort of a model, right? I think that is the biggest maybe like that's the biggest split that happened in our broad like economic model and even technological model in the 16th 17th century post the industrial and enlightenment era, right? And if you look at the works in Europe also, for example, in fact, like even yesterday I was reading a book by a philosopher on post artificial intelligence life sort of a thing. And even in that book, interestingly, he makes the same point that look at how technology has progressed. We used to treat trees and rivers and all these entities as spiritual, like there is a spirit that is residing in the river, there is a spirit that is residing in the tree, and now we don't. And look at all the progress we have done. So I think the Western mind looks at this conquest of nature as a progress, and I think for us, we are struggling to call it progress, and neither are we also able to go back to where we were, because that's not, I mean, the whole power imbalance and economic imbalance has shifted so much that we are unable to say no to let's say if somebody wants to build 100 dams on a river, we are unable to say like, okay, maybe 5 is the right number, don't go to 100, or 0 is the right number, or whatever that is, right? We are just not able to stop, because this whole the way the whole model is built is more in this exploitative sort of a model. And globally also, if you look, people don't seem to have great answers. Like if you follow somebody like Musk or Jeff Bezos, that sort of people, they'll say, I'll go to Mars, and don't worry, if that is the limit, we'll go to Mars, or let's occupy Greenland and take those resources. It's that sort of a thinking. There is no broad discourse in terms of how do I live in this place for not just my generation but for 7 other generations. So that sort of a thinking doesn't seem to exist. It is always about, if you are done with these resources, don't worry, we can pull the resources from elsewhere. So I think that's broadly some sort of a colonial mindset, perhaps. And I think the traditional Dharmic mind doesn't have this colonial mindset. So that's, I think, the struggle that we have for us. Like if you look at our own overall tradition in terms of how we managed our resources, it was always with some boundaries, with some limits, and then do this in this season but don't do this in that season, or this is for this community, or you stop after doing so much, that sort of a thing. So we always operated within the boundaries of limits. But the modern thinking is about, you tell me what the limit is and I'll tell you how to break the limit. Like if you say like I'll build a technology, or I'll build a new resource, or I'll invent something else, and which makes this constraint redundant. So I think the whole Dharmic mind was about like respecting those constraints and living in like in some boundaries. Like I'm saying that my material growth can be this much, but I'll spend more time on my spiritual growth or contemplative community life and all that. But now it is like, why are you putting that limit on your material growth? I'll break that limit for you, and I'll give, like, you can
Yeah.
conquer everything sort of a model, right? So that's, I
Mm.
think, a mental shift, and that shift has happened globally from maybe 16th 17th century, and for us it started picking up, I think, post
Yeah.
90s. That's pretty much where we are right now.
So where would you, fit in the Kumbh and its, the resounding attendance of the Mahakumbh and people going there? Where do we how do we explain that phenomenon when, we are saying, we are not bothered about our rivers which are next door in Hyderabad, but we have this great sentiment for a event that, has a planetary influence after 144 years. So how are we able to hold these two separate things in our mind and be comfortable with it?
Yeah, so like, I think we perhaps don't take these things as seriously until they like hit us, in terms of our, like, the consequences don't seem to hit the same population. Like, in the sense that if a river is getting dried, maybe there are 15 things that are getting affected, and maybe some things are much more long term. It may take 50 years or 60 years to see the effect, right? So uh, that distance is also one part. Pretty, like, the urban sort of a audience doesn't
Mm.
understand that, and then even in the rural sort of a population which is directly impacted, it is usually the locals or the immediate folks who react to such things, and the broader like imagery, we don't kind of perceive that, right? So in the case of Kumbh, for example, if Kumbh, like the place where the people were taking the sacred dips, if that was as bad as the foams in the Yamuna river, maybe we would have, like, reacted like in a very different manner. But
Mm.
because, thankfully, for some reason, right? I mean, we have not gotten there yet, and I hope we ever don't get there. But if you
Mm.
look at what people used to do in the Yamuna River, there were people who were, despite the foam, they were doing their Chat Puja there. Like, I think somewhere that there's that
Mm.
a mental sort of a model where we have kind of bifurcated these two spaces, that
Mm.
whatever happens, let it happen, but I'll do my prayer, gods will take care, kind
Mm.
of thing. But
Mm.
I don't think that is like a sustainable model, and I don't think that is also like a dharmic kind of a position. So maybe, I think we need to take these things much more seriously. So even, I think, if you look at the case of the Ganga River, also there being, like, you'll find various types of discourses. There are people who say that the natural flow of Ganga is broken. So even
Mm.
if you see some parts of the river which are good, it is only because you are only seeing that part of the river. But if you see from end to end, there are so many places where it's practically like sewage or that sort of a thing flowing there, right? So I think that is like, that's the criticism that we need to take a bit more seriously. And we also need to have some stance, like I said, right? Like, if tomorrow somebody says, I'll build 1,000 dams on the river, you need to have some stance. You cannot say keep building whatever you want, because at some point we have to acknowledge that like, you do some action and it will have some
Continue.
consequences. So I think there is definitely that challenge. Like, there are places where like, so many temple tanks and all, right? If you go to several temples, you see the temple tanks, they are full with a lot of dirt and they are dried up and all that. And there are now some initiatives
Yeah.
where people are trying to rejuvenate those temple tanks and recreate.
Mm.
But the fact that we have lived comfortably with those temple tanks for so long, I think
Absolutely.
there's something off there. Like, you see
Something.
waste
Mm.
packets thrown in, like plastic bottles thrown in, and we are okay with that. We just visit the temple, finish our puja, and then come back. But we don't bother so much about all that. So that's a criticism, like, a lot of others also level in when they say that you talk about all this dharma and ecology and all that, but even secular countries are doing much better in terms of their greenery than us. So
Mm.
that keeps coming back, where
Mm.
they say that like, somebody clicks a picture of they're living in US or Europe somewhere, they show up like a picture of a nice lake and then say that, tell me one place in India which looks as good as
Mm.
this. And yeah, I mean, it's difficult to answer that question, because even recently, like, I went to one of these tourist places, like hill stations, and
Mm.
it was quite bad. The experience of the water bodies, particularly the way they are managed, I like they were not great. So somewhere I think we have lost that, where we have somehow detached ourselves from how we look at we revere nature, versus we have become uh, like how the modern world treats nature as inert. I think we ourselves have become inert
Yeah,
with
becoming.
nature. Like, We are just not reacting
Yeah.
unless it comes and like knocks you at the door. Like for example, in Bangalore, right? Like last year, or I think even this summer, there are news that you might not get enough water because of
Mm. Mm.
groundwater and all that. Right? So that point, suddenly people will wake up saying, "Oh, what have we done? We didn't plan for this. We should do some rainwater harvesting or this that." But again, once the problem gets solved, you just move on, because until
Yeah.
it keeps hitting you, we don't take it seriously. So that piece does bother me a lot, in the sense that our own ancestors, if you look at our Puranas, if you look at Ardhashastra, if you look at Ramayana, everywhere you'll find a lot of these things on how this whole man nature
Mm.
sort of a model should be managed, and we have kind of abandoned all of that and just like
Mm.
blindly going on with all the destruction we are doing. So that definitely, I think, like people, at least in this like Dharma, IKS, this space, they need to take it a lot more seriously, because like quite ironically, I think the people who make noise on those are largely from the left. That's how things are today. Even today, in fact, I shared it in one of my like social media accounts as well. I read a very good piece by Ramachandra Guha written on Indian environmentalism, because I mean, before he got into all of this political Hindu
Mm.
critical or anti-Hindu stuff, he was originally an environmentalist and he did some good work
Mm.
there. And so for that kind of a space, there's so much that the Dharmic and IKS model can do,
Mm.
but somehow none of, I mean, those people don't engage, but at least we need to engage more. Like
Yeah.
for somebody like Ramchandra Guha, when he's writing this article, he'll just use secular terms. He'll just say that forest communities should have more control than state, and that it ends there. But traditional discourse, even where is your like respect for God? Where is the respect for religion?
Yeah.
Like you have something called a sacred grove, which says that in Kerala, even today, we have these like cows and all that. Right? There are forests which are
Yeah.
protected, and there is a deity. We see that in this movie, the Kantara. Also, we see that.
Yeah.
So this is all practically traditional ecological management models, right? But then uh, the Dharmic or IKS sort of people who need to ideally be leading that discourse, they are not doing
Yeah.
as much, and it's broadly driven across
Spoken
universities,
only.
broadly driven by leftism. So I think there's a lot more that we can do in that space.
Yeah. Actually, Maitri, who runs the Tiruvannamalai resort where I think the meta retreats are held, she was telling about how fishes, they even there in her retreat, they have fish so that that is the first indicator the plants and the fish are affected if something is wrong with the water. So it was even a very practical solution to testing water, and if something is wrong in the environment where you live in. So this was
Right.
part in all Kalyan. Even in Sringeri, you have fishes, and most
Correct.
Kalyanis had fish in them. So I think, like you said, we have to probably bring back these traditions and these practices.
Yeah, very much. I think we'll see this across animals, across plants. Like so, certain plants will have certain significance, right? And all the temples where you go, you would always see a certain kind of plants. You would not see like a croton, for example, right? And there are things there for a reason. So
Some
yeah, I think
functional, yeah.
yeah, those are the pieces where we need to like do a lot more exploration to uh, like socialize that whole knowledge. Like, why are things there? What is it that we are losing by like secularizing all these spaces, and the the whole reason to follow these traditions generation after generation, and the fact that they have stood the test of time after like so many generations. I think there's a lot that needs to be done there.
Yeah. So in one talk, you talk about, when we talk about technology, you say, technology should be used in moderation like salt in dal or kajal in the ice.
Mhm.
So how does one know what is moderation? Like, see, for somebody in the West, there is, like you mentioned, there is no moderation at all. We are like trying to see how far technology can go. But in the
Right.
Indian context, what would moderation be in a country which desperately needs technology, to bring up living conditions, standards, and economic growth, to fuel that.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think that's from the talk on Puri Shankaracharyaji's book. That's an analogy that he makes, and that's
Yeah.
something I distinctly remember, because like typically we don't hear our dharmacharyas talk about technology, and that piece was something I really liked a lot, because this whole idea of moderation is something that's close to my heart as well. But then I think I'll probably come to that specific question just by providing some more background, right? Which is that like I approached this topic primarily first not from the Hindu discourse. It was from a whole bunch of these scholars who studied philosophy of technology and technology of society right from like the 20th century. Like there are so many scholars who have done this sort of a work trying to understand what is the impact of technology on society. So like Lewis Mumford is a big name. There is Langdon Winner. There is Neil Postman. So many people are there. So these are all, I think, if you take a university course on philosophy of technology, these are pretty much like the textbooks that you go through. And these are all people who have called for some kind of moderation. And they said that you cannot just surrender culture to technology, that you cannot just say that like I'm not going to make any decisions. And I think one word that also a phrase that I remember, which I also cited in one of these talks, was that there is this thing called technological somnambulism, which is like sleepwalking through technology. We just adopt every new technology without thinking about the consequences. And in our own times, right, we see this happen where when social media came, there was a certain like euphoria that it's going to establish so many networks and communities and so much. But now, if you see after like maybe 20 years of social media, people are obsessed about regulation everywhere. Like minors should not be using social media, and then there is this whole sexual content, vulgar content, and violence, and how hate is being spread there, how elections can be manipulated with social media, and then how people are just getting disoriented and doing dark things. So there's now so much that is happening around social media, right? So the struggle with technology, I think, particularly with the modern technology, is that it's very difficult to like predict those consequences upfront. And it takes, I think, a very like an acutely sharp mind to even ask those questions. Like when you are let's say talking about something like social media, maybe even like 15, 20 years ago when it was being pushed, somebody should have like actually asked all these questions. How would you protect minors from using this? How would you protect children? What is the impact of an adult browsing the say that video or his feed for 10 hours in a day? These are all questions that we should have ideally asked then of usage. And we are now reacting to it saying that, oh, if you just before you are sleeping, don't stare at your phone because that will impact your sleep cycle. Stay away from your phone 30 minutes before. Don't browse so much. We are just like, now that we have seen some consequences, we are doing all this, right? And the same holds with let's say some even like a non-digital technology like processed foods, where so much of processed foods happened in the last 30, 40 years. And now we are saying, oh, but that particular thing was banned and that may have caused this disease. So one country will ban that and then 10 other countries will respond. So we are going through this cycle all the time with technology where we do that sleepwalking phenomenon first, where we just blindly adopt. And then we run into like all these challenges, right? So I think there, like, we probably need some sort of this level-headed and long-term thinking before we jump into these endeavors. So I think that is where I feel the whole dharmic discourse has a play, because dharma is never, I mean, that whole Sanatanatva's, the picture itself is coming because we are saying there are eternal principles, and we are not seeing it in this like YOLO or you only live once kind of a perspective, right? We are thinking about multiple lifetimes. We are thinking about intergenerational sustenance and all of that. So I think the whole broad philosophy of technology space is that needs a lot of dharmic intervention, and we need to get into this discussion. So this question on moderation, for example, is something that even in the West people answer by saying that moderation is not something of like taking away something from a poor man or something like that. You need to think of it more as how digestion operates, right? Like you don't keep on gobbling food. After a point, you know that my stomach is full, and then you take a 3 4 hour break. It is not like the entire day you're eating all the time, right? Because you know that this is the limit of the food that I can consume for this period. And the next time you are hungry, that is the only time that you are going to consume food. So our interaction with technology also needs to have that sort of a balance. We cannot be like obsessed with it.
Overuse.
I think there also, like again, because of the way geopolitics play out and all that, there are of course some borderlines you can draw, saying for national security, this technology is important, and maybe there is some way we need to deal with that. Maybe we need to draw a distinction between massive consumerization at an individual scale of a particular technology
Mhm.
versus what you do for national security or what you do for like a particular industry, right? Maybe for the country's overall sovereignty, you might have to do something on transistors and chips or things like that. You have to do that perhaps, but that doesn't mean you have to really invest in trying to, like how a social media company operates, right? It tries to operate the amount of time you spend on the app, but the nation need not think about how do I make everybody use this technology. That level of consumerization, maybe that's not something that we need to obsess over, because it's very difficult to predict these consequences.
Mhm. So I was reading about Steve Jobs and how he was influenced by Indian dharmic principles throughout his career, and how it made his ideas of design, and how he conceived Apple to be very minimalistic because of the kind of, he also lived a very simple life. Apparently, he used to not buy too many clothes and things like. Do you find that technology leaders are influenced by such dharmic values in India? Have you found any trend or any such influence?
Yeah, I mean, I think in parts, the some
Mm.
things, there is an influence of some of these things. Like Steve Jobs may be influenced by certain kinds, right? And there are some people, let's say, who are into this mindfulness, meditation kind
Mm.
of a thing. They absorb some of these things. But broadly speaking, I would say, like personally, I don't find the trend uh, uh, like very encouraging or directionally changing a lot, because the way people are using Hinduism in these contexts is mostly like a productivity hack, which means how can it make me better, how can I be richer, or how can I be more productive at work, that sort of a thing. Like read Gita to become a good manager, that kind of a thing. I mean, while they have their place, but I think it's not limited to that part alone. So there I feel like I haven't seen a lot of encouraging work. Like for example, lot of our businesses these days are more in terms of like they're in the greed is good sort of a model, right? Where the more you can
Profit.
grab, the more you grow, kind of thing. But greed itself is not seen as it's seen as a vice in tradition, right? So you have this whole Arishad Varga and all these things. So those are all not seen as something that is to be celebrated. So even if you take something like a trading app, right? So if you are doing like a trading app, or people are doing like a betting app, those are places where you need to question that what are the moderations, what are the limits, and do I really need to sell this so much, do I need to advertise this so much? So I think those are the places where dharma has a bigger role to play than these kind of like one-off inspirations. While they are good, I'm not saying they are bad, because it still helps for the whole dharmic discourse to spread, and for people who are outside of the fold to like get connected. But I think the overall function of the dharmic discourse is much broader. I feel there's a lot more that we can do in terms of the whole economic model, in terms of how the world broadly operates, geopolitics and all that, right? There's so much more for dharma, and there on those aspects I have not seen like a lot happen.
Mm.
Like in India, if you see, look at the products that we are consuming and the products that are getting built, there's nothing very like Indic or Dharmic about those things. Maybe like in the food industry, here and there these days, you see some more like conscious efforts that are being done. But
Mm.
usually the conscious ones are the pricey ones also. Like the
Mm.
costliest
Mm.
items are organic items, right? So it's not really targeting the masses, where and the kind of food that the masses are consuming, they may not be of the best quality or built with the whole Dharmic like ecosystem in mind. So I think broadly speaking, I don't see a lot of encouraging signs.
Yeah. In in many of the discussions that you had, I saw, I noticed that a lot of books on American indigenous communities were being quoted, and their values and how their beliefs, and how we can learn from them, and some of them were like very beautiful, actually, the books that you were
Mhm.
talking. Do we
Right.
have such books in modern times, which, of course, we have so many authors now, but are these books for the common person, in maybe even in a Western, person who is a seeker can come and, celebrate it the way we find interesting the indigenous stories of America and stuff?
So you're talking about books written in the American context, or are you talking about things like that
Books,
which people we can
yeah, books
like?
written in American context of their indigenous people
Right,
are,
right,
have value systems which all of us can, relate to and even feel a sense of, wanting to be like that, which is actually very core to
right,
our practices.
right.
But in terms of content that we put out and in terms of books we write, do we have, books of that which even, anybody left or right or any, space would be able to celebrate?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think even there, maybe you'll find like two flavors of content. One is with people who are like maybe people like me of those cultures who want to truly identify and like respect their tradition, that sort of thing. So you'll find that. You'll also find another set of books or literature which is about somebody who's trying to use that for their own ideological purposes. So you would see let's say the left in the US universities or even authors there, right? They try to use that to pitch it against the let's say the white American sort of an enterprise. So they try to fight their battles using this literature. So those need to be avoided, of course. But there is indeed a bunch of people who try to talk about their own traditions, like for the example you gave, right? Like something like ancestral worship. You'd find so many ancestral worship traditions in the Native American sort of tribes or jatis, which are very similar to what we do. Even the routines that they follow, you can relate to all of that a lot. So I think even within Indica, for example, I think Edward Butler he has this whole polytheistic sort of a division, right? I learn a lot from some of the stuff that he shares on the internet as well, where there's just so much that is happening in those spaces that even when you read it, it feels like maybe it's some other relation of yours sort of a thing. That's the sort of
Correct.
commonality between those traditions and ours. And where I particularly like the like this whole Native American experience is in terms of their encounter with let's say the schooling, for example. Like you'd find this in Australia, you'd find this where children from the indigenous communities, they were separated from their parents, put into these boarding schools. You will find it in Canada, you'll find it in US, and then even Africa, for example, they have gone through these experiences. So in the Native American context, for example, you'll see a lot of these rituals which were kind of demonized or which were declared illegal. And now after like some 5 6 decades of activism, maybe in the 90s some ritual again got legal sanction saying that you can actually do this. So you'll find this maybe with the sun dance, and there are some specific rituals there, like they had some animal sacrifice or something like that in their rituals. Those got banned. Their languages got banned in the schools. So when so you'll find these whole discourses where the Native American parents who are there in the reserves, right? So they gave this reserve area where they said that you can stay here and live your life, and then from there somebody moves out and then goes to the colonial school and comes back. The parents then say that I'm not able to relate to this fellow. He's my son who was with me, but now after a year or two of this schooling, he has lost the language. His way of dressing has changed. The way he makes his hair has changed. Everything. So that whole rupture in terms of how this factory schooling kind of a model actually disrupts that continuity between one generation to another. There is a lot that we can learn from the that Native American experience there, because in the Indian context, usually what will happen is because our whole picture has come from the school education or from this sort of ideologically biased literature, we tend to blame our own tradition for our failings. We'd say that we are bad, we needed reform, that tradition was evil, social evils, patriarchy, oppression, all these things, right? But if you read a similar experience of some other tradition, they may not even have the same construct the way you are having, but they also suffered through the same things. Then you'll perhaps understand, perhaps it's not us, it is the other side, the models that have been imposed from the other side. So let's say if you look at the Native American context, even they had hundreds of languages. How did all those languages die, and then practically why is everybody just speaking English there? And then you come back and look at our context. Oh, but whatever happened has happened, but in India, why did so many languages survive? So then you get into these things, right? Like maybe all cultures had these diversities, and perhaps there is a broader journey that is happening from heterogeneity to homogeneity. And then for some reason, the Dharmic world has been able to resist that homogenization, and we are able to cling on to a lot of these diversities still. And so those are, I think, questions or areas of introspection that will open up when we go through these journeys of like other cultures with went through this colonial modernity. So there I think that there are a bunch of books. I think it will be in fact good for Indica to also do some like a 101 level sort of a course or a symposium sort of thing on these aspects, right? Because there's so much that you can relate to. Personally, even like in the African context, when I read some of these things, it feels so close. Like I can practically, but this is like almost like what I see, like I did, or my friend did, or my friend has a ritual in
Correct.
his village, which is very similar. It's that kind of a connection.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember in college we had a book by Chinua Achebe, and the even the names, the way they name their children, the name
Right,
had a meaning. Just like
right,
us, we name after deities, and always there
right,
was there was purpose for the name also. It was
right.
not just how short it is, how modern it is, how easy it is to pronounce, not like that.
Correct,
So
correct. Yeah.
a lot of similarities, like you say, between our cultures. So it
Yeah,
would be
yeah.
good to
So I think
explore.
that will actually build a lot more positivity overall in terms of the discourse. That usually we tend to get into the political spaces and ideological battles, that sort of a thing. But this whole fact that perhaps all of humanities had like so many commonalities, right? So
Yeah,
I think there, particularly for people who are oriented towards culture, there is like so much of these cultural commonalities between all these places that
yeah,
I think that discourse will definitely add a lot of value overall.
yeah. And give us pride and strength also, maybe
Right,
in
right.
the
And I
name
think
of
you'll also start respecting your own
yeah,
traditions more. Like, because
yeah,
if you consider it as something innate to the human condition versus
correct.
something that somebody has imposed on you or something, right?
Mm,
If it's actually you start appreciating it as a
yeah,
natural thing, then you'll also start practicing things with far lesser guilt. It feels
yeah,
like it's a part of you.
yeah, absolutely. See, you say that 5% of problems should be addressed at the national level, with the rest solved locally. So this was
Mhm.
another conversation. So this is not happening in any government or in any democracy or in any nation today. So how can we, why should we do this, and how can we do it?
Right. So I think that sort of ties back to a lot of these other things that we were discussing at the start, right? This whole ecological aspect, cultural aspects, and then economy, all of that. So these are just, I think, two models. One is more like with a much more focus on decentralization, and one much more focus on centralization. And you're right in the sense that this whole nation state construct and post nation state economies, all of that emerged, typically they'll all go to this top down sort of a model where a command center eventually will like command the whole economy, right? And then with the globalization and overall globalist sort of a setup, right, where maybe one or two nations are able to dictate so much that happens everywhere. Like if you look at what happened when like 2 3 years ago, when the Ukraine Russia that conflict happened, right? Companies sitting somewhere could just plug like disconnect the payment systems sitting like somewhere else. So that's the sort of model where we are going to this like a techno state sort of a model with huge centralization, where practically everything sort of is controlled from there. Like today, for example, we run like so much of our economy runs on imported petrol and diesel, all that comes from somewhere, right? And during COVID, or when we had that, there was this in the seafair traffic, there was this whole disruption for a brief period in between. So something can happen somewhere else, and it can like totally affect people elsewhere. So that sort of a thing is more of a reality now, versus in the past your king might be fighting somewhere in the war and he might be dying, but your village, things are just happening the way they are, because that's how that model was. I think that there maybe the capacity to absorb these shocks and all of that is probably much better. Not everybody will get affected with everything else, but if you look at things like how the global pandemic sort of a model they operated, one incident in one place can just practically pull down the entire world together. So this model, I think, is more has this what in like technology we call this like a single point of failure sort of a thing, where one thing breaks and practically the whole thing breaks, kind of thing. So in terms of orientation also, I think that is how we were like the whole reason why we are this poly sort of a culture where so many diversities are is because we were decentralized with so much of it, right? That's why, like, we don't have like a one temple construction style. If you look at a Kerala temple, a Karnataka temple, in fact, within Karnataka, you may find 10 variations. You go to Odisha, you may find something. You go to Gujarat, you may find something, because every point, like every node was its own universe. Like the microcosm and the macrocosm, it's like both were, each was reflecting in the other. So we were in that model, and that model demands that sort of a decentralized sort of a structure. Otherwise, we are going to march more and more towards homogeneity and eventually this top-down sort of control. I think fundamentally that is an adharmic construct. So, based on my own understanding and my own reading, I feel this sort of a like top-down one point sort of a control model is definitely adharmic. Now that said, this whole 5%, 95% thing also comes from some of these discourses from our dharmacharyas. That's also because, again, I mean, there's of course this whole sovereignty aspect, right? Like we discussed before, that there are so many countries surrounding your own country, and there's so much of geopolitics playing around. So the way things are operating today, like one country will have so much of a nuclear arsenal, right? So unless the others also have some sort
Yeah.
of that, their security is also under threat. So I
Company.
think, so on matters of like national security and things like that, maybe you still need to cede that space, that you just don't have a choice because your survival itself is at stake. But in terms of actual economy, or in terms of how rest of the country operates, I think more and more decentralization or federalism in that sense is more helpful. Otherwise, I think we'll just be too stuck in this setup where the local innovation doesn't really bubble up, and you're always waiting for something to come from somewhere else. And even in terms of our economy as well, right? If you look at the way things are today, practically the entire country is run from maybe five or six countries. Sorry, five or six cities. Most of the GDP is concentrated there. Like where I stay, a huge percentage of Telangana's GDP is from Hyderabad. You take out Hyderabad, then practically like there's very little economic activity based on if the state can stand. So I think that is not like a very helpful sort of a picture. In fact, like recently there was this books that the IGNCA published, the Indira Gandhi Center for the Arts. They published this book written by Dr. J.K. Bajaj and MD Srinivas. They are Dharampalji's associates. So they wrote this book about two places in Tamil Nadu where they went through the British pre-British era records to understand how that particular place was. So these are, I think, one was Kundratur, and the other I am not able to recollect the name, but these are essentially small places in Tamil Nadu, like a small village or like a collective of villages kind of thing. And you see, like, so there are like that small place will have like 40, 50 temples. There is so much of ecosystem there. And that's the sort of decentralized sort of a model where every place can actually grow to that sort of a stature. But the modern discourse is largely anchored around one or two big cities where all of the action happens. I personally I don't feel that is very sustainable. And then, like I said, I feel that will also homogenize things a lot more and also centralize things a lot more. My definition of dharma is more oriented towards heterogeneity, diversity, decentralization, and each of these nodes are trying to like replicate or trying to realize dharma as a whole. So even a small village can be dharmic. So that small place can realize dharma. It doesn't need to rely on some resources from some city or anything. So that's the model I think we need to get to eventually. But it runs contra to some of this whole progress, technology, and that sort of a discourse. But those are things I think that we need to grapple with. I don't see how this current trajectory is sustainable or even dharmic. We'll have to get to more decentralized and local sort of models.
Yeah. I don't know how much of this is, the problem with the narrative and the optics, because there is a group which is, documenting the food traditions of Telangana and Andhra Pradesh.
Mhm.
So I went with them to Anantapur, that was their first district, and we found that, the food traditions there are so alive and so different from Hyderabad. And
Correct.
but whereas everyone talks about Hyderabad biryani and Hyderabad food, whereas
That's
we
right.
found that there are so many more traditions alive and peaking here, but never reported, never documented, never celebrated. Everybody comes to know about the popular dishes, which is pan India. You have standardized that, and you have
Right.
standardized the palate. and you have branded it as Hyderabad cuisine. Whereas Andhra Pradesh and Telangana have so many rich traditions, from pickles to vegetables to the grains they grow, the land, the soil is so different, the climatic conditions are different, and it's very much alive. It's just that not reported and not, people are not aware of it. So, how much of it, is a problem with the storytelling aspect? Which is true,
Yeah,
even in other states also. I mean, if you go
right.
to central Karnataka, or you go to even Kerala, the village life is perfect. People are growing their own grains and eating whatever is local, and it's all happening, but not the what we read is not their stories.
Correct. Yeah, yeah. So I think, like I said, right. Thankfully, in the case of the Dharmic civilization, lot of diversities have still withstood this whole current that came and hit us. So unlike maybe like the languages of Native Americans or even their cuisines, right? Our cuisines and languages are still surviving. Maybe the cuisines are surviving better than the languages, of course.
Yes.
So
Mm.
we do see those surviving diversities, and one challenge I see why they don't get into the whole narrative is also because I think the English narrative is largely dominated by the like the urban sort of spaces where things are much more like homogeneous and much more standardized. So like the kind of food that a typical urban person eats, even in Hyderabad, like if you are in Telangana, here, right, things are still a bit more standardized. But as you go to for a festival, if that's happening, and you go to your hometown or things like that, you may see more diversity. And then from there, if you go down to your village, you may see much more diversity. So there's a bit of that standardization that has happened because our I think in our urban model, we kind of let go of a lot of these diversities, and then now I think slowly we are coming back where now if you see like a lot of these millets places have come up, right? People are trying to appreciate millets, and there are a lot of these in fact in the just responding to that Hyderabad biryani sort of a point, right? In the food business in the Hyderabad itself, on the restaurant space, if you see, now there are a lot of these Telugu places have come up. So there is this restaurant chain called I think it's called Antera. I thought it was some fancy Western name, but it's actually Andhra, Telangana, Rayalaseema. So now there are
Okay.
people like that making those, like in fact where
Yeah.
I work in my office complex, there is there's some place just showed up called Telugu Tales. So these are all I think now,
Mm.
uh, although they are still standardized in some sense, but they are trying to expand that whole
Right.
menu. Essentially, they are trying
Mm.
to rediscover the traditional cuisines. And in terms of this overall broader like anti-processed food sort of a tendency also, right? So I think slowly people are also rediscovering some of their own traditional snacks and traditional foods. Like when I was a kid, right? Like let's say in 90s, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, all that was so big, right? Like Tendulkar, Amitabh Bachchan, everybody was doing those ads. In the Telugu film stars were doing those ads. But now, if you try to sell that carbonated drink, it doesn't have the same appeal anymore. There's so much of negativity and so much of correlations with obesity, all of that established. So now, again, there people are trying to discover what then were my ancestors were having if it was so hot. What were the traditional drinks, and then all those things, right? So I think in terms of cuisines, thankfully, a lot of our traditions are still there in some shape. Although the challenge there also, I think, for the urban setup particularly, right? You don't have those spaces to grow them anymore. So even if you
Yes.
know that this sort of
Yeah.
a thing exists,
It
but to
could.
grow it, like people are living in a apartment community with some 300 flats. So what will they grow? They just have their balcony garden at best. So this is maybe useful in some places where people have their own house or their own farm plot, and then maybe there are some companies which are now growing those and then selling these
Mm.
goods back to the cities. But slowly I think that consciousness is coming. So wherever these traditions are alive, in some sense, I think these are coming back. So I think we see this with festivals also, right? Where when a particular festival is happening, you'll have some offerings, some prasadams, or some dishes that are cooked. So I think there again, people will realize, oh, then I need this particular leaf. Oh, this plant doesn't grow here. So maybe next time I'll probably for my community will grow this plant here. So those things are all slowly happening. So I think some of these, because some of our traditions are still surviving and handed off as living traditions, maybe there is some hope these things may come back. And you'll start looking at these. But there are also counter forces, so it's not so
Mm.
straightforward, because there are
Mhm.
also, like, if you look at this whole agri economy, there are so many of these MNCs, so many of these agro huge like multi-billion-dollar majors, right? So they cannot handle diversity, because their models are about like one
Mhm.
product or two products kind of
Simples.
thing. So they
Mhm.
may push a certain kind of
Mm.
products into the markets, and they may outprice certain others.
Mm.
So all of that is also happening. I think we'll continue to see this sort of play out. I don't think
Mm.
the traditional like I said, right? I don't think the Dharmic mind will give up on its cuisine diversity. We are going to push back. Like you are not, like we see that happen with the breakfast as well, right? Kellogg's in 90s, they were reported to have said that will replace your breakfast, but now they have to shift, and then they have to identify this pellet, and then start selling to this breakfast. So some of these things, I think we are still holding very tight, that I want home cooked food. And in fact, recently, I think last week, there was this controversy where one of these podcasters and startup sort of I think it was Nikhil Kamath or somebody, right, where he tried to say that Ghar ka khana is an addiction for Indians. In Singapore, people don't cook at home. There are these community sort of places where you buy. Why are we not going to those models and all that? And then there's a whole backlash. People are saying, how dare you say this about Ghar ka khana?
Yeah.
Because I think some things we still hold on to, although
Yeah.
I mean, they are challenged, like maybe because like both the couples may be working, might be busy all the
Yeah.
time. Traditionally, it was like cooking was done largely by women in the house, right? But the woman in the house also is now challenged with her time. They may be in like a 9 to 9 job with a travel or all of that, right? So some of them may not be able to spend as much time in the kitchen, so we have some cooks. And then in some places, maybe you have typically you'll have one more like a grandparent or your in-laws, somebody staying there, so some knowledge from there. So I think we are still trying to hold on to the home kitchen somehow. And I think these cuisines are still there, like you said, like pickles and all that.
Mm.
They are still there. People try to make that
Yeah.
pickle and then say they share it with their neighbors. Somebody goes
Mm.
home and get something from there saying this is very unique from my hometown. So some of these diversities are still there, and I hope they stay. So yeah,
Mm. So
but it's a challenge.
maybe as a, yeah,
Like
as a
some of these
last
and all that,
yeah,
right? We should
sorry.
start.
As a last question, maybe if you could tell me, what is it about our acharyas, especially the Puri Acharya, Shankaracharya, what is it about their mind where, they could look far ahead into the future and, say things which are so relevant and, it's really so insightful. So, what was it that most touched you about his book? Could you share, what is the one thought that, his advice or his insight that we should actually, take very seriously and follow?
Sure. Yeah. So I think for me, like I mentioned at the start of the this interview or talk, right, that I was reading a lot of these kind of discussions on the Western discourse, where people are multiple people from multiple perspectives are talking about these things. And when I started engaging more and more with the content from our own dharmacharyas like Puri Shankaracharya, Kanchi Parmacharya, Sringeri Acharyas, Madhvacharyas, all these people, I found that there was so much more like that the thinking was much more complete, much more holistic, and much more long term. And broadly, I think like somebody like Puri Shankaracharya, when he speaks on these matters, I see that whole Sanatanatva, or this whole sustainability sort of an emphasis, right? Like you're not planning
Mm.
for this generation or for your lifetime or the next lifetime. You are planning for something that stays, like something that is eternal. And those
Mm.
eternal principles and that guidance, I find that very fascinating. So the fact that they are able to tap into that intergenerational wisdom or knowledge base, right, that this is something that has survived through so many generations. Like if you are doing a certain prayer and you are do it in a certain form, that knowledge is there for like it went through so many iterations, right, so many generations after generations. If it was so bad, or if it was negative, or if it was not giving what it is meant for, it would have been discarded already. But the fact that these things are surviving for so long, that I think that adds a lot of weight to this kind of discourse. So when let's say somebody like Puri Shankaracharya is talking about some of these matters like ecology, economy, and all those things, right? Where he's saying that this particular line is from Srimad Bhagavatam, or this particular line is from so and so Upanishad, or this line is from Bhagavad Gita, and all that. I think it feels uh, 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 it kind of hits you somewhere inside that why am I running so many places around the world trying to read this thinker, that thinker? Perhaps my tradition itself has so much of wisdom on these matters, and why is it that we are just like acting as if it doesn't exist, or it doesn't matter, or it is outdated, or like discriminatory, oppressive, whatever, right? We are just keeping that in a cold storage on so many of these matters, and we are leaving that whole territory to be driven by a broadly Western sort of knowledge systems or Western sort of thinking. So I think that's the lesson that I take by listening to somebody like Puri Shankaracharya, or even many of the other acharyas, or overall like traditional parampara systems, right? That these are all like, this is us, this is our wisdom, and we need to really tap into that. We cannot just ignore that and then try to just work around. So yeah, I think that's where I see a value, lot of value, in fact.
Thank you so much for this conversation. And, for most of us who are so busy, caught up in our lives, and who don't have time to, or maybe even, who don't know how to go about getting this information, your social media handles and your videos are so illuminating, and, actually point us to, where we should go and seek this knowledge. So I think on behalf of everyone who hears, I would like to thank you for investing the time apart from your own. All of us pursue this knowledge for our own spiritual growth, which is
Right.
very very enticing to be so self-absorbed in your spiritual growth that you spend a lot of time on it. But to make the effort to share that with others is something really wonderful, and I appreciate that. Thank you so much for that.
Sure. Thanks, Aparnaji. Thanks also for this opportunity. It was great to have this conversation. And I think one of the reasons why I also engage on these topics is also it helps build these communities, spread the good word, and also learn, right? Like I try to understand what is it that is missing in my own understanding, or how do I have to communicate this particular topic tomorrow to somebody else, or if a familiar question comes, I'll be able to like tailor my answer accordingly. And when somebody else is asking those sort of things, right, it feels like this is something that's like a universal problem that is plaguing a lot of us. It's not something that like you said, like you should not limit it to your own selfish sort of a pursuit. This is dharma is also about the entire community and the world at large, right? It's not just about a secluded pursuit. So I feel it's good to see all these forums also open up. Maybe like 10 years ago, you would have been just isolated writing a book, or scribbling on a paper, and then around you people may not be as aware. But now with all these forums opening up, it helps to just get connected with so many like-minded people. And I think Indica is doing a great job in stitching these networks also. I personally on this meta retreat, for example, the one that you spoke of, we have a small group that got created, and there's so much action that happens there. I learn a lot from those. So I think all these conversations are broadly helpful in improving the dharmic quotient of us and of the society at large. So that's how I see it.
Yeah, yeah. I think also the paucity of our access to traditional gurus with whom we can walk the path from beginning to end is disappearing slowly. See, our access to traditional a guru who can guide us in every aspect of our
Right,
daily life
right,
is difficult to find. The guru has to find you, and he's busy in his trying to earn
correct.
his living and his
Yeah, right,
so having satsang with like-minded people is a great boon, even though people sometimes are critical of certain
right,
information being so open source. So but I
correct.
still feel there's value for the one earnest seeker if he is gets access to that information, and can be very transformative.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah,
Hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much, and have a good evening, and looking forward
yeah,
to more conversations with you.
sure, definitely. Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you. Namaste.